There is a silent pattern that makes many people start and never finish. And the most dangerous part is that at the beginning, this pattern looks positive. It is full of energy, full of motivation, full of intention, but it is not sustained. And everything that is not sustained was lost. You have seen this happen. Maybe you have lived it. You start something new, with enthusiasm, with focus, with a promise that this time will be different. And for a few days, it really is. But then, something changes. The intensity drops. Discipline weakens. Consistency disappears. And little by little, everything stops. Not abruptly, but silently. And when you realize it, you have already abandoned it. And shortly after, you start again. Another plan, another idea, another attempt. And the cycle repeats. Start. Get excited. Slow down. Stop. Restart. And this creates a misleading sense of movement. But it is not progress. It is repetition. Andrew Carnegie understood that the problem was never starting. Starting is easy. The hard part is continuing when motivation fades. Because motivation does not sustain a process. Discipline does. And discipline is not emotion. It is repeated decision. Another point that fuels this pattern is the search for novelty. Everything new creates excitement, creates interest, creates energy. But that energy is temporary. And when it fades, if there is no structure, the process stops. And then the need for something new appears again. And that keeps the cycle active. Always starting, never finishing. Another factor that sustains this pattern is unrealistic expectations. The expectation of fast results, of immediate visible progress, of constant return. But real processes do not work like that. There is a period where nothing seems to happen, where effort is not rewarded, where progress is not visible. And it is exactly at this point that most people quit, because they confuse silence with lack of results, when in reality, it is construction. Andrew Carnegie knew that results are accumulated, not instant, and that there is an invisible time where everything is being prepared. But this requires patience, and above all, consistency. Another important point is the lack of real commitment. There is intention, there is desire, but there is no firm decision. And without decision, any difficulty interrupts, any discomfort diverts, any obstacle stops the process, because there is no strong enough reason to continue. And without continuity, there is no completion. Another pattern that prevents finishing is perfectionism. The need to do everything perfectly, to wait for the ideal moment, to only continue when everything is aligned. But that blocks progress, because the process will never be perfect. And waiting for perfection is postponing completion. Andrew Carnegie did not operate with perfection. He operated with progress. And progress comes from continuous execution, not from ideal conditions. Another factor that sustains this cycle is the lack of aligned identity, because it is not enough to want to finish. You must see yourself as someone who finishes. If your identity is still someone who starts and stops, behavior follows, because behavior follows identity, and identity is built through repetition. If you repeat abandonment, you build an identity of abandonment. If you repeat continuation, you build an identity of consistency. And that changes everything. Another critical point is the relationship with discomfort over time. At the beginning, there is energy, but then comes boredom, routine, repetition, and it is not exciting, but it is necessary, because it is in repetition that results are built. And those who cannot handle repetition do not sustain growth. Andrew Carnegie understood that success is not made of intense moments. It is made of consistent processes, and this requires maturity. Maturity to continue without emotion. Maturity to act without desire. Maturity to sustain even without immediate results. Another important factor is the lack of a system. Relying only on motivation is unstable. Relying only on willpower is inconsistent, but creating a system, create structure, define schedules, clear actions, simple processes, and this reduces decision-making. And the fewer decisions, the more execution. Another point that blocks completion is distraction. You start something, and in the middle, you change focus. Another idea appears. Another opportunity arises. Another path seems better. And then what was started is abandoned. Not because it would not work, but because it was not sustained. Andrew Carnegie valued focus, because focus allows depth, and depth generates results. Without focus, everything becomes shallow, and what is shallow is never completed. Another decisive factor is how you measure progress. If you only value the final result, you will lose motivation halfway. But if you value execution, you continue, because you see progress in the process, and that keeps movement alive. Another essential point is responsibility. As long as there are excuses, there is repetition. I don't have time. I don't have resources. I don't have opportunity. But often, what is missing is consistency. And consistency depends on decision. And decision depends on posture. In the end, everything comes back to a simple point. You do not finish because you are still operating with the logic of starting. And starting does not build results. Continuing does. And continuing until the end transforms. That is why the change is not in starting better. It is in stopping the habit of quitting. In sustaining when it gets difficult. In continuing when it becomes boring. In moving forward when there are no visible results. Because that is exactly where most people stop. And those who do not stop stand out. Andrew Carnegie understood that what separates those who arrive from those who do not is not talent, is not luck, is not opportunity. It is continuity. And continuity is not about intensity. It is about not stopping. In the end, it does not matter how many times you start. What matters is how many times you finish. And finishing is what builds results, is what builds identity, is what builds growth. And that requires a simple choice, but a difficult one. Stop living in the cycle of starting and enter the pattern of finishing, even without motivation, even without recognition, even without guarantees, because finishing is not comfortable, but it is transformative. And the moment you finish once, and when you break this pattern for the first time, something changes permanently, not only in the result, but in the way you see yourself. Because until then, there was a silent doubt. Can I really take something to the end? And that doubt influenced everything. It influenced decisions. It influenced attempts. It influenced the level of commitment. Because deep down, there was insecurity about continuity. But the moment you finish, even if it is something small, that doubt loses strength, and something new appears. Confidence based on evidence. It is not motivation. It is not excitement. It is proof. Proof that you can sustain. And that changes the internal pattern. Because now, the reference is no longer abandonment. It is completion. And that changes the way you start something new. You no longer begin only with enthusiasm. You begin with responsibility. You do not start on impulse. You start with intention. And this drastically increases the chances of continuity. Andrew Carnegie understood that small, consistent wins create a solid foundation. And that foundation sustains bigger challenges. Because real confidence does not come from positive thinking. It comes from history. A history of execution. A history of continuity. A history of completion. Another point that changes when you start finishing is how you deal with difficulty. Before, difficulty was a signal to stop. Now, it becomes part of the process. Before, discomfort interrupted. Now, it is absorbed. And that is essential. Because any project, any goal, any change will require going through difficult moments. And those who cannot sustain those moments never reach the end. Another important factor is that as you develop the habit of finishing, you begin to notice patterns more clearly. You notice when you usually stop. You notice what thoughts appear. You notice what excuses show up. And this increases awareness. And awareness allows adjustment. Without awareness, the pattern repeats automatically. With awareness, it can be interrupted. Another decisive point is the creation of real commitment. Not just starting something, but committing to the end. And commitment does not depend on emotion. It depends on decision. A clear decision. I will go all the way, no matter what happens. And that changes posture. Because it removes the option to quit. And when quitting is no longer an option, the mind searches for solutions, searches for adaptation, searches for continuity. Another relevant aspect is how you organize your goals. Many people fail because they create goals that are too big, without structure. And that creates overload. And overload leads to abandonment. That is why breaking things down is strategic. Small steps, small deliveries, small completions, and this keeps progress visible. Invisible progress sustains motivation. Andrew Carnegie applied this principle in his projects. Divide, execute, complete, and repeat. Another essential factor is the discipline to maintain the basics. Not constantly searching for something new, but sustaining what already works. Because growth does not come from constant novelty. It comes from efficient repetition. And efficient repetition builds results. Another critical point is the ability to ignore distractions throughout the process. Because there will always be something trying to pull you away. New ideas, new opportunities, new possibilities. And not all of them should be followed. Knowing how to say no is just as important as knowing how to start. Because every new beginning interrupts an ongoing process. And continuity is what builds results. Another important point is emotional consistency. Not every day will be good. Not every day there will be motivation. Not every day there will be clarity. And that cannot define continuity. Because if it depends on emotional state, nothing gets finished. That is why acting regardless of how you feel is essential. Doing what needs to be done, even without desire, even without energy, even without enthusiasm. This builds internal strength, and internal strength sustains execution. Another relevant factor is the relationship with time. Many times, there is a rush to finish, and that creates anxiety. And anxiety leads to mistakes, and mistakes lead to frustration, and frustration leads to abandonment. That is why respecting the time of the process is essential. Not too slow, not too fast, but consistent. Because consistency leads to completion. Another essential point is clarity of purpose. Why does this need to be completed? Why does it matter? Why is it worth continuing? Without a strong reason, any difficulty interrupts. With a clear reason, continuity sustains itself. Andrew Carnegie had clarity of purpose, and purpose sustains effort. Another important aspect is understanding that finishing is not the end. It is the beginning of a new level. Because each completion increases your capacity, increases your confidence, increases your discipline. And that allows bigger projects, more complex ones, more challenging ones, and growth becomes progressive. Another decisive point is eliminating dependence on motivation to finish. Motivation may start things, but it does not sustain them. What sustains is pattern, a pattern built through repetition, through decision, through continuity. And when this pattern is consolidated, you no longer depend on wanting. You simply act, and that changes everything, because it eliminates instability and creates predictability, and predictability generates results. In the end, everything comes down to this. You do not need to start better. You need to stop quitting. You need to sustain. You need to continue. You need to finish. And that does not require talent. It does not require perfect conditions. It does not require the ideal moment. It requires decision. A decision repeated every day. Today I continue. And that decision, over time, builds something that once seemed impossible. Consistency. And consistency builds completion. And completion builds identity. And identity defines the level of your life. From this point on, it is no longer about trying. It is about becoming someone who finishes. And someone who finishes no longer lives in cycles. They live in progress, continuous, directed, and inevitable. And when this pattern of completion becomes stronger, something emerges that completely changes the way you live. Predictability, not in the sense of knowing exactly what will happen, but in the sense of trusting your own process. Trusting that, regardless of the difficulty, you will continue. And that confidence changes decisions because it eliminates constant doubt, eliminates hesitation, eliminates that recurring thought, will I stop again? Now the question no longer exists because the answer has already been built through action. You continue, and this creates a level of stability that few people reach. Andrew Carnegie understood that internal stability is what sustains external growth, because without stability, any progress is temporary. Another point that emerges at this stage is the increase in execution capacity. Before, small tasks felt big. Now, bigger tasks begin to feel possible. Because there is history, there is practice, there is accumulated repetition. And that reduces resistance, reduces doubt, reduces procrastination, because the pattern is already established. Another important factor is the speed of recovery. Before, any mistake led to abandonment. Now, mistakes lead to adjustment, and continuity is maintained. This reduces interruptions, and by reducing interruptions, progress accelerates, because the problem was never making mistakes. It was stopping after the mistake. And when stopping is no longer an option, mistakes lose their power and become just part of the process. Another decisive point is the development of automatic discipline. At the beginning, everything requires effort. Everything requires attention. Everything requires conscious control. But over time, this transforms. Action begins to happen with less resistance, with less effort, with less internal conflict, because it has become a pattern. And patterns reduce friction. And less friction means more execution. Another important aspect is clarity of limits. Knowing what not to do. Knowing what not to start. Knowing what not to take on. Because now there is an understanding that every new beginning has a cost. And that cost can compromise what is already in progress. That is why choosing better becomes essential. Not starting everything, but starting what will be finished. And that raises the level of results. Andrew Carnegie operated with this level of clarity. Less dispersion, more focus, more depth, and more results. Another critical point is the relationship with pressure. Because as you begin to complete more, expectations increase, internally and externally, and this can create tension. But when there is a solid pattern, pressure does not paralyze. It directs, because there is structure to sustain it. Another important factor is consistency across different phases. Good days, bad days, moments of energy, moments of fatigue, favorable situations, difficult situations, and still, continuity. Because now it does not depend on conditions. It depends on decision. And sustained decision creates stability. Another relevant point is the reduced need for motivation. Before, you needed to feel like doing it. Now, it is simply necessary to act. And that simplifies everything. Less internal negotiation, less resistance, more execution. And consistent execution generates results. Another important aspect is the relationship with long-term time. Because now there is vision. There is clarity that results do not come in the short term, but they come if there is continuity. And this reduces anxiety, reduces unnecessary urgency, and increases the quality of execution. Because rushing decreases, and consistency increases. Another decisive factor is the consolidation of identity. You are no longer trying to be someone consistent. You have become someone consistent. And that changes everything. Because identity sustains behavior. And repeated behavior sustains results. And results reinforce identity, creating a positive cycle. Another important point is the ability to build more complex projects. Because now there is a foundation. There is discipline. There is continuity. And that allows you to advance. Longer projects, more challenging ones, more strategic ones, and that elevates the level of your life. Andrew Carnegie built exactly like this. Starting, continuing, completing, and expanding. Another essential aspect is emotional independence. Not depending on how you feel to act. Not depending on validation. Not depending on external stimulus. This creates freedom. Freedom to execute. Freedom to build. Freedom to advance. Another critical point is maintaining the pattern over time. Because building is difficult, but maintaining is more challenging. And maintaining requires attention, requires adjustment, requires constant awareness. Because the old pattern never fully disappears. It only loses strength, and it may try to return. That is why vigilance is still necessary, but now with less effort, more natural, more integrated. Another important factor is silent consistency, the kind that continues even without recognition, even without immediate results, even without validation. And this builds something rare, solidity, and solidity sustains long-term growth. In the end, everything comes down to one simple point. You stop being someone who starts and became someone who finishes. And this change redefines everything. Not only results, but possibilities. Because now there is confidence. There is structure. There is pattern. And a consistent pattern does not fail. It simply continues. And by continuing, it builds. And by building, it transforms. And by transforming, it elevates. And by elevating, it expands. And by expanding, it creates a completely different reality. Not based on attempts, but based on completion. And completion is what separates intention from result, idea from achievement, and potential from reality. From this point on, there is no longer a cycle of starting and stopping. There is a flow of continuous execution, where each step leads to the next, where each action builds the following one, and where stopping is no longer an option, because continuing has become who you are.